On behalf of the Eden Prairie Chamber of Commerce, I want to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Pat Mulqueeny. I serve as the president of the chamber, and I do want to thank our ongoing sponsors of programs like this. We consider this part of our Women's Network program, but also part of our Young Professional Summit event that we do every year. And we're pleased to have Starkey Hearing Technologies, Hamline University, and the young professionals in Minneapolis supporting those programs. So shout out to them and big thank you to them. Getting into the bio for Heather, Heather Welpley is a speaker, coach, and author of the book, An Overachiever's Guide to Breaking the Rules, How to Let Go of Perfect and Live Your Truth. She has led workshops and webinars on overcoming perfectionism, creating your own rules for success, wellness and self-care in the new normal, in our topic today, imposter syndrome, with thousands of people at different companies and conferences across the US. Prior to owning her own business, Heather worked in a wide variety of leadership development, human resources, and change management roles at Cargill and Ameriprise for 10 years. She recently moved from Minnesota to Colorado, where she is hiking and exploring as much as possible. Please join me in welcoming Heather. And just a quick reminder to stay muted. We'll have some opportunities for interaction. But with that, Heather, I'm going to turn over hosting rights to you and let you take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Pat, and welcome everyone. Thank you for having me. I always welcome an opportunity to talk about this subject. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So you can choose whether I would love for you to stay on video, because it's always lovely to see a few faces on the side of the screen and realize that you're all real people. But if you want to have your video off, that's completely fine as well. So we're really here today to answer 4 questions. The first one is just, what is imposter syndrome? So if you were not familiar with imposter syndrome before today, that's completely fine. We're going to discuss exactly what it is in just a moment. The second one is, how does it impact you? Third, why does it happen? And finally, and maybe most importantly, what can you do about it? So I want you to walk away here today with some really concrete practices and tools that you can use the next time that imposter syndrome shows up. This is going to be very interactive. We're going to be using the chat a lot, and you can feel free to use it at any time to comment on anything or comment on what someone else has shared in the chat. And there's going to be several times when I'm going to specifically ask you to share in the chat as well. We'll also have one breakout room a little bit later so that you can get into small groups and meet some new people and have a short discussion about imposter syndrome with that group as well. All right, so let's go ahead and share in that chat right now. I would love to hear just a little bit more about you. So 2 questions. First, do you work inside of an organization, or are you an entrepreneur? That just helps me to know who's in our audience today so I can share some examples that are going to be relevant to you or to the group as a whole. And then what would you like to get out of our session? So you can go find the chat and share those into the chat so we can get a little bit of an idea of who is here in the meeting today and what you'd like to get out of our session today. So I'll give you a second to do that. And there's no right or wrongs. If you weren't familiar with imposter syndrome before, maybe all you want to do is learn about what it is or what you can do about it, and that is perfect. But if there's something more specific, I'd love to hear that too, to make sure that I can cover that during our session. I'll give you a second. I can see people typing. So I'll give you a second to share into the chat what that might be for you. I know these are 2 questions. It's a little bit longer than your typical chat. All right. Solo law practice. Perfect. Thank you. I want to know more about what imposter syndrome is. So faculty have a consulting practice. Okay, this is really helpful. I'm really glad I asked this question. Yes, Peggy, you're right. All faculty have it. I don't know if it's all, but it's interesting what academia is actually the one field that's been researched that we know that men and women experience imposter syndrome at the same rates. So there might be true in other fields as well, but it's the one field that's been researched in that. Yeah, so entrepreneur, perfect. Yes, part of an organization, wanting to know more about it, as well as foster better learning on teams. Okay, perfect. So if I don't get, there are a few specific things you can do for others related to imposter syndrome. So I will do my best to remember to share that at the end. If I don't, please pop back in and ask that question. Perfect. Work within an organization looking to learn more, work with a nonprofit. Wonderful. A senior at Eden Prairie High School. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love that we have some students on here. Student and imposter syndrome absolutely impacts students, particularly as you might be applying to colleges or figuring out what you're going to do next for your life. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, good. We have a wonderful variety. Thank you so much for sharing. It's helpful to know a little bit more about who is in the room so that I can use some examples relevant to you. And you're absolutely going to get everything out of the session today of what you put into that chat. So let's move forward with that and let's answer that first question right now, which is just, what is imposter syndrome? So imposter syndrome, to a certain degree, is kind of self-explanatory. It is feeling like an imposter or feeling like a fraud, feeling that doubt, that insecurity, even though you are qualified and successful in whatever field or area or stage of life you are in. And that second part is really the crux of imposter syndrome. It's this mismatch. It's thinking of your skills, your qualifications, and your experiences as lower or worse than they actually are. So in reality, they're up here, but it feels like they're down here. And some people feel this way every single day. I've had multiple people tell me, how they're every day on my way to work, or at least when we used to go to work in person. Every day on my way to work, I feel like today is going to be the day that someone figures out I have no idea what I'm doing, and they're going to come tap me on the shoulder and escort me out the building. So that's one side of the spectrum. The more middle side of the spectrum is people who experience imposter syndrome in certain situations that tend to provoke or exacerbate that feeling of being an imposter or faking it or feeling like you're a fraud. And we'll go through some of the most common scenarios in just a few minutes. And then the other end of the spectrum are people who over-assess or overestimate their skills, qualifications, and experiences. We've probably all met a few people like that as well. So the final thing I want you to know about imposter syndrome here on the basics is that it's something you experience. It is not something you have. So it sounds like a psychological diagnosis because it has that word syndrome in there, but it's really not. It's something that you experience, which I personally think is comforting because that also means that it can come and it can go. And so you know that when imposter syndrome comes, it can leave again as well. We also know that about 70% of people experience imposter syndrome. So although you might feel like you're totally alone experiencing these because no one comes into work and is like, gee, I feel like a total fraud today. How about you? Like no one talks that way, but at the same time, so many people are experiencing it. And I think that's one of the things you're going to see here today is just how many individuals experience it. We also know that women and people of color tend to experience it more strongly, which we'll talk about why in just a moment, although there are plenty of white men that also experience imposter syndrome. All right. So that is the basics of just what imposter syndrome is. But really, I think you're going to get this more as we talk about the thoughts and feelings associated with imposter syndrome. So really, this starts in your head. It starts with the inner critic in your head and these thoughts that come up. I'm going to run through some of the most common imposter syndrome thoughts, or common thoughts associated with imposter syndrome. And I want you to be thinking about which ones of these apply to you, because they're going to be a little bit different for everyone. Right? The first one is, I don't know enough. So I don't know enough to be in this room. I don't know enough to go for that job. I don't know enough to go for that bigger client, any of those things. Sooner or later, they'll realize I'm a fraud. So I have just been faking it. I have been fooling everyone. And sooner or later, they'll realize I'm a fraud. I'm too old. So I'm too old to change careers. I'm too old to do something different. Or the converse of that one, I'm too young. I'm too young to speak up. I'm too young to go for a leadership position. It has to be perfect, and it really wasn't that good. There's a strong overlap here between perfectionism and imposter syndrome as well. They're not the same thing, but people who tend to experience imposter syndrome also tend to have some perfectionist tendencies too. I'm not ready yet. A very subtle one of like, I'm not ready yet. I just need another year of experience. I just need another certification. I just need another thing. And then I'll be ready to go for that job, to go for that client, to ask for more money, whether you're in a job or as an entrepreneur, all of those things. So I'm just not there yet. Or the secondary one, the sister one of that, is it's not ready yet. So that idea you've been pondering for months, but you haven't shared with anyone because it just needs a little more research. Or you just need to change the font one more time on your website before hitting publish, or you just need to edit something just a little bit more because it's not quite ready yet. I just got lucky, so I'm here. That's not because I have earned it. I just got lucky. I'm not really an expert. I'm going to share a very quick story of my biggest imposter syndrome moment ever. I had been leading these imposter syndrome workshops for a few months. This was a couple of years ago. So I was relatively new, but I had done several and they'd gone very well. And a woman from the University of Minnesota reached out to me on LinkedIn, so someone I didn't know, and said, I'd love to talk to you more about having you come in and talk on imposter syndrome for a leadership development program we have for tenure track professors. So keep in mind, tenure track professors are all people who have PhDs. I happily got on the phone with her. I was very excited. I felt confident going into the call. And then as we were talking more about the group and the program, she said, Heather, we don't usually hire external speakers, but this topic is so important to our group that we really wanted to hire an expert. And that one word flooded me with imposter syndrome from head to toe. All these thoughts came into my mind, like, I'm not really an expert. You all have PhDs. You're the ones that are experts, not me. Who am I to think I can come in and teach you anything? So the good news is none of that came out of my mouth. It stayed in my head and I said yes. But then once I started designing the session, I started going overboard and feeling like I needed to prove it. I needed to prove that I knew enough. I needed to prove that I belonged in this room. So I better include a bunch of academic references. I better show them that I know what I'm talking about because I didn't feel like I was enough of an expert to be there. And in the moment of that, in the moment of designing, I had this realization that I was experiencing imposter syndrome about teaching on imposter syndrome, which might be the biggest irony ever, right? But also that these people were just people. And yes, they had PhDs, but not in this field. And in this instance, I did know more than them about this. And that's why they were hiring me to come in and share thoughts and tools on imposter syndrome. So I share that experience because one little word, I went into that call feeling great and feeling confident, and literally one word swooped in that imposter syndrome. So that can happen to you too. You might be confident 95% of the time, and then occasionally imposter syndrome just comes in out of nowhere because of a word or because of a comment or a look even. And those things can really bring on some of that self-doubt and imposter syndrome. All right, let's keep going. I haven't earned this. So similar to I just got lucky. It's already been done. Very true for entrepreneurs, or anyone in a creative field. What do I have to add that's anything new? Why would someone hire me for that? There's tons of people who already do that. They chose the wrong person. So they chose the wrong person. I'm here, but clearly this was just a mistake. I don't belong here. I hear that often in rooms with people that feel like bigger clients or senior leaders. Who am I to fill in the blank with whatever it is you want to do? Who am I to apply for that super selective college? Who am I to apply for that job? Who am I to think I can be a leader? Who am I to write a book or start a podcast? Any of those things, the who am I to? And then finally, just I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough to do that thing I'm thinking about. So I want to hear from you in the chat. Which of these imposter thoughts do you experience? And if it's something different, please put that into the chat as well. This is not an all-encompassing list. These are just some of the more common ones. So let's hear from you. Take you a second to put your thoughts into the chat. Which of these thoughts do you experience? It has to be perfect and I just got lucky. Yeah, absolutely. And there's, like I said before, there's a strong overlap here between perfectionism and imposter syndrome. So that it has to be perfect is maybe a little bit more on the perfectionism side, but there's a lot of similarity there. What else? I'll give you another minute here. I don't know enough. Yeah, that's probably the most common one I hear from people. I don't know enough. It has to be perfect. Yeah. What else? I'll give you one more second here to type in. Sooner or later, they'll realize I'm a fraud. They'll find out I'm a fraud. Yeah, absolutely. It's important to know how this shows up for you because it is a little bit different for everyone. And I will tell you, I didn't experience much imposter syndrome when I was a corporate employee. And as an entrepreneur, I experience it quite frequently, particularly when I was new as an entrepreneur. I came on a lot. So it was a fairly new experience to me. So for some people, and I'm the same human, right? So we experience it differently in different scenarios too. Yeah, I don't know enough. I need to do more research. Muriel, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a kind of a similar one to the it's not ready yet. I just need to do a little bit more research. Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I want you to keep thinking about how this shows up for you because it is different for everyone. So those are the thoughts in your head, but then inevitably it shows up in real life too, in different scenarios, and it has real life consequences. So where are the places that are most common for imposter syndrome to show up? The first one is around any time, whenever you're around people that feel higher. And I put that in quotations because no one is higher or lower than anyone else, but yet we've probably all had that feeling. So that could be around senior leaders in your company. That could be around a client that is bigger than another client that clients that you've typically worked with. I've heard people say this around people who have more money than you, or like you're working with, a financial advisor, you're working with clients who have more money than you. Or if you have let's say you have a high school diploma and you're in a room with people who have college degrees, or you have a college degree, but you're in the room with people who all have an MBA. Any of those things can bring on kind of that power differential where you feel like people in the room know more than you, they're higher up than you. That can really bring on that feeling of I don't belong here, or I don't know enough to be here. The second one is when you're the only one of you in the room. And this can show up in several different ways, like primarily if you're the only woman in the room, if you're the only person of color in the room, if you're the only person that identifies as LGBTQ, any of those scenarios are places that it can bring on imposter syndrome. It can also be in a professional kind of qualifications arenas. And I'll give you an example. In one of my past jobs, I supported plant operations, but I was in HR. And so I went to a meeting in Houston with about 40 people who were all 40 people, suppliers and people internal to my company. I was the only woman and I was the only one in HR for a 3-day meeting. And the men were fantastic. Like there was nothing untoward. They were all inclusive and welcoming. And at the same time, I was aware every single day of that meeting that I was the only woman and I was the only person in HR. And it definitely brought on some feelings like, can I even ask a question? Like, all these people are engineers. They know so much more than I do. And they did know more about engineering than I did, but really they didn't know more. We just knew differently. But that feeling of being the only one can really bring on imposter syndrome. The next time is anytime you're sharing publicly, and that could be very publicly, like up in front of a room or on a webinar, social media, if you're portraying yourself as an expert or knowledgeable on social media. It can also be just sharing an idea in a meeting, either with your team, with leaders, with a client. Any time of those can bring on that feeling of like, do I know enough to share this? Am I enough of an expert? Or what will people think when I share that? Any type of career transitions is the next one. I'll tell you, this is how I started working with imposter syndrome, as I was coaching a lot of women several years ago when I first started my business who were in career transition. And they came to me saying, I feel stuck in my job. I'm not sure what I want to do. I want to be purposeful about my next move. And once we got into the coaching, though, it was discovered that it wasn't so much that they didn't know what they wanted to do. It was that on some level, they didn't think they could do what they wanted to do. They couldn't go for the VP level job. They couldn't start their own business. They couldn't do that thing that they were really wanting to do. And I knew that this was imposter syndrome. And I knew a lot of these women personally, because that's what happens when you first start a business. And sorry, I'm just trying to let people in here at the same time. All right, perfect. And I knew how amazing these women were and how they would be an asset to any organization or business. And I thought something has to be done about this. We have to get the word out about what imposter syndrome is. So know that any type of career transition, from looking at jobs to interviewing to negotiating for salary, any of those. And this all goes with clients as well. So I would say if you are an entrepreneur, anytime you're working with a bigger client or you're putting something new out there or anything related to sales and business development is a time that imposter syndrome is likely to show up. And then the final one is kind of interesting, but it's after you have a big win. So after you get into the college or academic program of your choice, after you've had a paper published that you were really excited about, after you've gotten a new job, after you've launched a new product, then that feeling of like, oh God, did I just get this by chance? Is it luck? Have I really earned this? Is it really as good as I think it is? Or now I'm here, but I'm in over my head and I don't know what to do. All of those things are really places that imposter syndrome can show up. And the one thing that these all have in common is they are all outside your comfort zone. So know that anytime you are taking a risk, stepping outside your comfort zone and trying something new is a time when imposter syndrome is more likely to show up, and that it can actually be a positive sign of your growth and development, because that means that you are doing something different. It means that you're putting yourself out there. Now, we don't want the feeling and experience to be so strong that it holds you back, but if it's just a little bit, if it's just there, you can actually kind of flip your mindset around that and say, this is actually a good thing. It means I'm growing and developing and trying something different. Then next here are some of the consequences of imposter syndrome. Then we're going to move into breakout rooms for a few minutes so you can discuss this as groups. But those are the situations where imposter syndrome starts. And then it inevitably has consequences on your life and career as well. So I've noticed there tend to be two groups of people when it comes to imposter syndrome, and you might identify much more strongly with one or the other, or it could be a mix of both. First is the group when you experience imposter syndrome, you hold back from opportunities. So because you're experiencing that feeling of, I don't know enough, I don't belong, I'm not enough of an expert, that I just got lucky, you don't speak up in the meeting or share the new idea, or you don't go for the job, or it's the things that you don't do because you don't go for the big client that you're interested in working with. You don't do the things because of imposter syndrome. Or there's the group that I personally fall into, which is you say yes, and then you overwork to prove yourself. So people appear, you are successful, you appear to be very confident, but then when you get in there, you're like, I'm not sure I know enough to be here, so I better prove that that this was worth their investment. I better prove that I belong in this position and that I can do a good job, which can lead to poor boundaries and saying yes and just overworking in general. Both of these can have an impact on your career development, whether it's from overdoing or not delegating. Sometimes can show up if you're the overworker, or just obviously if you're not going for those opportunities that might be out there. And they both have a stress, anxiety, and burnout component or consequence to them as well, which is pretty logical when you look at what some of those feelings are. If you feel like you have to do more all the time to prove yourself. And I'll also say the people who might be holding back from opportunities from imposter syndrome, you're still working plenty hard as well. You are also likely to overwork. And a lot of times that's where some of that perfectionism can come in there as well. All right. So we've talked a bit here about what is imposter syndrome, how does it show up, and some of the consequences. I'm going to move you into breakout rooms here in just a moment. As I do that, I'm going to pause and see, are there any questions about anything we've talked about so far? So you can either put that question into the chat or you can unmute and ask. So I'll just pause for a second. And we'll have time at the end too for questions. Okay, if you're typing, keep typing because I'll see it pop up in the chat in a second. But what I'm going to do here for breakout rooms is, one second here, and I'm actually going to pause the recording here for a second. All right, I have resumed the recording. Welcome back. I'm guessing you were all having good conversations because no one came back until you had to. So I think you're probably having good conversations there. If you could all mute again now that we're in the larger group, that would be wonderful. I appreciate it. So we've talked just about some of the basics of imposter syndrome. Let's now move into why does this happen? Because it's really important to know why, and then we'll move into the what can you do about it. So there's a couple of core reasons about why we experience imposter syndrome in the first place. The first one is that your biology, to a degree, is working against you. It's working for you and it's working against you. Essentially, your brain wants to keep you safe and alive. That is its number one job, which means that it is constantly scanning the horizon for threats, risks, anything negative that could potentially hurt you, both physical threats as well as emotional threats, which is where imposter syndrome tends to more show up. And it really doesn't know the difference between the two. And so particularly if something negative has happened in the past, like you shared an idea and you got shut down, or you just weren't listened to, or you went for a job and you didn't get it, or you got tough feedback, or you got publicly called out for a mistake, any of those types of situations, your brain does not want to repeat those. And it does a lot to send you signals to not repeat those. And that's where some of that inner critic can come in and say, you don't know enough to do that. Remember when that happened before, you don't want to go there again. Who are you to think you can do this? All of those things. It's not just related to imposter syndrome. This is a very broad-based thing. It even has a name called negativity bias. So this is one of the reasons that is your brain is wanting to keep you safe. And in this weird, convoluted way, imposter syndrome is kind of doing that. The unfortunate thing, though, is that in this case, safe often also means small and not doing the things that you know you could do or feeling the way that you could feel about your own skills, qualifications, and experiences. The cultural reasons, though, are much deeper than the biological reasons. So we, in the United States in particular, this does vary depending on what culture you came from, but we have a culture of overdoing perfectionism and constant comparison. And this is, our kind of US culture as a whole, but if your family culture also was a proponent of this, like you had to get straight A's and that was just 100% the expectation, or if your organizational culture, the company that you are part of, currently or in the past, has a really high perfectionism. So like if you are called out when you make a mistake, or 8 different people have to review a PowerPoint before it is called out. The interesting thing, where I know we have one faculty member here, like just the academic environment of constantly questioning can play into this as well. And so every culture is slightly different, both, organizationally and family culture. So this is going to impact people differently, but it's not a big leap here if we have this culture of overdoing and perfectionism and constant comparison to feel like you're never enough, like you're not doing enough, you're not enough, and it can bring on some of those feelings of imposter syndrome as well, and being behind. So there's a lot of cultural components here. And then a second aspect of the cultural components is gender and racial discrimination. And there's a couple of reasons. Well, first of all, I want to point out gender and racial discrimination are not the same thing. Like I, as a white woman, am not experiencing the same thing in general, and even as it relates to imposter syndrome as a woman of color. But I put them on the same screen and talk about them together because they relate to imposter syndrome in the same way. So there's a couple of reasons that we know women and people of color tend to experience imposter syndrome more frequently than white males. And the first one is that there are fewer role models and fewer people in leadership positions that are women and people of color, just kind of across the board. And so it's not a big surprise if you look around and you're looking, forward in your career and you're like, no one there looks like me. It's not a big leap to think like, do I actually belong there? Do I belong in that room? So that's one of the reasons. The next one is microaggressions that women and people of color are more likely to experience. And I hate the term microaggressions because I feel like it makes it sound small when in reality they can be very big. So these are comments, insinuations, direct or indirect comments that like you only got hired because they needed a woman, or you only got this job because you are a diversity certified business or something like that. Those comments that are really direct and indirect that cut at your experiences, sorry, I lost my train of thought there, your experiences, your qualifications, and can really make you question, if you're constantly getting that from around you, it makes sense that you might question, do I actually know enough to be here? Or was that a reason I got this job? And then the third one is that we know that women and people of color tend to be literally questioned more and listened to less. And this is collectively, we do this to each other as well. But we've probably all been in a room where you see in front of you, or you have felt the effects of, one person shares an idea and really no one really pays attention to it. And then 5 minutes later, another person shares an idea and everyone's like, yes, that's great. That's absolutely fantastic. Let's do that. That's what I'm talking about here. Frequently, not always, of course, but frequently that first person is a woman or a person of color, and the second person is a male or a white male, and they're more likely to be listened to. And we also know that women and people of color are like literally questioned more. Your intellect is questioned more. Your opinions are questioned more instead of just taken as fact. And so it makes sense if other people are questioning you more, that you might start to question yourself as well. And that's where this imposter syndrome comes in. So I share this whole cultural component because I don't want anyone to walk away here thinking that it's your fault that you experience imposter syndrome. There are significant structural components going on here. And yes, there are things you can do about it for yourself. And we're going to get into that in a minute. So you can do things for yourself to work through imposter syndrome, but it is not your fault that you are experiencing it in the first place. And then finally, this isn't anywhere in the research, but I've had so many people tell me that in the last almost year and a half now, or 14 months, that they've experienced so much more self-doubt and imposter syndrome than ever before, that I feel the need to bring it up. We do not have a blueprint for what we have experienced over the last year. I mean, if you are a business owner, if you are a leader, you don't know how to lead a team through a pandemic. through uprisings, through understanding and learning how to talk about race in the workplace, how to pivot your business if you're a business owner, how to work from home, how to lead a team virtually. Like there was a lot of unknowns there are, and there still are, about how you might be returning to work or changing the way you work or not, what's staying the same and what's different. There's a lot of question marks out there, and we don't have a blueprint for any of it. So if you are questioning or feeling that more in the last year, know that that's very common and very normal. All right. So let's move into now, what can you do about it? Because I always feel like this is like the slightly depressing moment in the presentation because we've talked about just what all of this is, but we haven't talked about what you can do about it. And there actually are a lot of things that you can do. So we're going to talk about some things that you can do in the moment when imposter syndrome shows up. And then I'm going to give you some deeper reflection questions. And then I'll share briefly, it's not in the slides, but I'll share briefly at the end what you can do for others as well. All right. So the first thing here is very simple. It is simply to name it to tame it. So when you notice imposter syndrome show up for you, tell yourself, that's just imposter syndrome. That's okay. I can feel that, and I don't have to make decisions based on it. So this sounds so simple, but now that you know what imposter syndrome is, you'll notice it when you're feeling it, and just naming it automatically decreases some of the power. So very simple thing that you can do immediately, name it to tame it. This also works with emotions and lots of other things as well. So name it to tame it. And then when it does show up, treat yourself with compassion. Again, recognize this is not your fault that you are feeling this way. It's very normal to feel this way. That's part of self-compassion as well, recognizing that other people experience imposter syndrome in addition to you. You are not alone. And then practice talking to yourself like you would a friend, which I know can feel a little awkward, but it really works. And I'll tell you that I just recently started doing this with kind of another part of my life that I'm working on, but standing in the mirror and looking at myself and saying the words makes such a bigger difference than just kind of like rolling them around in your head or even saying them out loud. But looking yourself square in the mirror and saying with conviction those words helps so much. It's like you're giving yourself a pep talk, but this pep talk with conviction. So it's something I highly recommend. Like I said, I hadn't ever done the mirror thing until about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it's really, really working and really helping a lot. So, but treat yourself with that compassion, let go of any judgment that you might be feeling of like, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this imposter syndrome. Why can't that inner critic just go away? And just practice treating yourself with compassion when it comes up. The next one then is to look for the real evidence, because the inner critic that comes in, that's not the real evidence, or that's maybe 3% of the real evidence. It's not the other 97% that's going on. So look for that evidence that you are skilled, you are qualified, you do have the experience, the accomplishments, the success. You can literally write that down, write down some of your biggest accomplishments, write down the things that you're good at. You can also give yourself permission to update your resume or update your LinkedIn profile and just own everything that you are doing. This has nothing to do with job change specifically, but just giving yourself that permission to own your strengths and own your accomplishments and write them down on paper. If this is really hard for you, because it is for a lot of people to own your strengths, it can feel arrogant, even if you're just admitting it to yourself. I highly recommend doing this once a week to look back at the week and say, what went really well this week? You can also take a learning approach to it of saying like, what would I do differently? But really looking at what went really well this week? What am I proud of? Where did I step outside my comfort zone? What were my accomplishments this week? And all you're doing when you do that is you're getting your brain trained to also look for the real evidence for the positive things that are happening out there, because it's automatically looking for the negative things. That's happening automatically. So this is not about looking through the world through rose-colored glasses. It's just about balancing things out and having a more accurate perception. You can also keep, I love to keep a kudos folder in email. So that's like anytime someone compliments you or tells you you've done a good job or the impact that you're having, file those away into a folder of some electronic or paper folder. And on those days when you are doubting yourself or where you're feeling a little lost or feeling that imposter syndrome, go back and look at it and remind yourself that you are good at what you do, that you are making an impact, and that you should keep going. And then finally, there are going to be times when you feel in over your head. That's a sign of growth and development. When you start a new job or you start a new project and those feelings can come on like, oh, do I really know enough to be here? Have I just been fooling everyone? Did they choose the wrong person? And remind yourself of other times in the past when you also had no idea what you were doing and felt totally in over your head, and you figured it out along the way. You don't have to know everything when you start. You just have to know enough to start. And then you figure everything else out along the way. So remind yourself of that time you started with a big client, or you started your business, or you started a new job, or you started at a new school. Any of those situations, of those times when you really did feel completely in over your head and you figured it out anyway. That is just as much of the real evidence as your actual skills, qualifications, and experiences. All right. The next one here might sound a little counterintuitive, but it is to notice your inner critic, to notice those thoughts in your head, and know that it is not you. It is just a voice in your head. It is not something that you have to make decisions based on. It's not something that you even have to pay attention to, although I realize that second part is easier said than done. But it's really not something you have to pay attention to. You can, or make decisions based on. You can start to separate yourself from that inner critic. Know that it's not you. Know that it's not a voice, or it's just a voice in your head. You can even name your inner critic if that's helpful to you. And if anyone has a name for their inner critic, you can definitely pop it into the chat, because that it's always fun to see. You can treat this with a little bit of humor. I personally call my inner critic the valedictorian. The valedictorian is the part of me that feels like I always need to work harder, do more, be better, all of those things. So when that voice comes up, it's like, because that's really where my imposter syndrome comes up. It's like, do more, do more, do more. That I improve yourself. You got to prove yourself. I remind myself, like, that's just the valedictorian talking. There is a part of that's me, but it's not the fullness of me. And there's more of that to me. And then, so when you notice that inner critic, name it, call it out, and choose a different thought. Purposely choose a different thought. And I'm going to walk through an example, and then I want to hear what your new thoughts are, because they can be really empowering to share. So just as an example, if you are, you put yourself into whatever category or whatever situation this works for you, but you are offered to take on a bigger role, or you are thinking about submitting a proposal to work with a new client, whatever the case may be here. So you have this offer to do something bigger out there. Then the imposter syndrome comes in saying, I don't know enough, I don't belong there, I don't know enough to do that thing, which then leads you to either say no, or to say yes, but then overwork to prove yourself. So this is kind of one thought pattern that leads to real life consequences and actions on the outside. A different thought pattern, though, is it still starts with the same thing. So you have that offer to take on a bigger role. But then if you really specifically choose, instead of I don't know enough, or when I don't know enough shows up, you say, I know enough, and I'll learn the rest along the way. I mean, how much more freeing is that, and less pressure is that than I don't know enough, or I have to know it all, which then can lead you to say yes if you would have said no before, or to set healthy boundaries. So you say yes, but then you don't feel that need to constantly overwork and prove yourself. This is easier said than done, but when you do this over and over again, it really does make a difference in your actual actions and in your thought patterns. And those new thought patterns can become more automatic over time. So this is one possibility here, but I want to hear from you. What is your new thought? So if you think back to several minutes ago when you put in the imposter thoughts that you tend to experience, when that next time that one comes up, what's a different thought that you can put in to your head? I would love for you to share in the chat, because it's really fun to see and really empowering to see what's a different thought that you want to share. And I love to hear, have you have it in your back pocket already when you leave here today, so you know what that thought is, so that you can replace it the next time it shows up. So as you're putting that into the chat, I'm going to also say that the next time you choose that new thought, whatever it's going to be for you, then act and make decisions based on that new thought, even if they're uncomfortable. And so you can take action based on the new thought, even if it's uncomfortable to do so, even if there's self-doubt there. And that's when those new beliefs and new behaviors can really come into play and get embedded. So I'll give you a second for anyone who wants to share. Instead of saying, I don't know enough, say, I know how to find and collaborate with talented others. Oh, I like this. And I know how to let others shine so we can all win. Yeah, because you don't have to know it all, right? No one can know it all. It's about finding other people too, who know other things than you, know different things than you. I love that. I can find a way to learn what I need to know. Yeah. These are wonderful. I don't know enough, but I can figure it out. I love that. Yes. So maybe I don't know enough right now, but I can figure it out along the way. Yeah. I love Rosie. Thank you so much for showing us that kudos folder that you use that and you go back and look at it to give you confidence to tackle other projects. I love that that's working for you. Thanks for sharing that. All right, keep putting things into the chat. I want to move us forward so we can get through the rest of the tools, but keep putting things in the chat if you have new thoughts to share. The next one is to recover fast when doubt strikes, because experiencing doubt, experiencing imposter syndrome is inevitable. Like we said before, it's also a sign of your growth and development. So what we want you to do is to recover fast when doubt strikes, so that it doesn't hold you back from doing the thing you want to do, or doesn't help you to, or doesn't exacerbate that feeling of having to prove yourself and overwork. So I want you to create today a doubt recovery toolkit. And that sounds fancy, but it's really not. It's really just a couple of actions that you know work for you to recover quickly when that doubt and imposter syndrome strikes. And I have a couple of categories on here that you can think about. I highly recommend everyone has both a movement and a quiet practice. I believe almost all of us need more quiet in our lives, whether that's a walk or prayer or meditation or painting, you know, things sometimes these things overlap as well, but more quiet. The challenge is if you are really in a ruminating state where, like, we've all been in those places where you just feel like things are circling up around in your head and you can't get them out of your head. If you sit down to do a quiet practice, unless you are a trained meditator, it's likely that you're just going to sit there and continue to spin. And that's where movement can really come into play. So whether that's walking or running, I love to dance. I will turn on one song and dance to it, and it changes my entire outlook. It gets me out of my head, into my body, and makes me feel good. So that having a movement practice is really helpful. Being around the people that just make you feel good, or playing with your pets, and then creative practices can help a lot as well. So my 3 pieces that are in my doubt recovery toolkit are dancing, like I already said, hiking. There's just something about getting out and putting my feet in the dirt that is very both calming, centering, and confidence building. And then listening to anything with Brene Brown. I absolutely love her. If you aren't familiar with her, she's a shaman social researcher. I like her books too, but there's something about listening to her voice and her podcast that really helps me to just get reconnected and feel like I have confidence, and also the confidence to be vulnerable as well. So what are yours? What's in your doubt recovery toolkit? Just 2 or 3 actions that center you, that decrease the nerves, that decrease the self-doubt, and increase your confidence. So go share those in the chat with everyone, because it's fun to see, fun to get ideas from each other. And as you're doing that, I will say that you can use this doubt recovery toolkit reactively, so after imposter syndrome shows up, or you can use it proactively if you are going into a situation that you know tends to exacerbate your imposter syndrome. So as an example, I had a client about a year ago who knew that walking into a meeting with her boss and her biggest client at the same time was like her recipe for imposter syndrome. She just knew that that combination was, yeah, it always brought on imposter syndrome. So she would take a run in the morning whenever she could. She would go for a run the morning of those meetings, because that run took her from here to here. And so when she went into the meeting and came out the meeting, she still got knocked down, you know, a little bit. She still felt a little bit of that self-doubt and imposter syndrome, but she still ended up so much higher than she would have if she had not gone for that run. So again, you can do these both proactively and reactively. All right. Any thoughts? I would love for you to share in the chat. What's in your doubt recovery toolkit? So I'll give you a second to do that. It is fun to see. All right, as you're doing that, I'm going to move us forward because I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure we have time to cover the rest and to do some questions as well. But keep sharing because it's really fun to see. All right, the next piece here is some deeper questions that you can write down if you want to. We're not questions that we are going to answer today because they are too deep, but this is really about knowing yourself. These are questions you can reflect on your own or with a coach or with a therapist. That are about knowing who you are and your strengths. So the first one is just, what are your core unique strengths? What makes you you? And I'm not talking about a performance evaluation, although there might be some good feedback on there, but really what makes you uniquely you? What are the unique things that you bring to this world? And then leaning into those once you know them can help to, because once you recognize your unique value, it can help to quell some of that self-doubt and imposter syndrome, and know that yes, other people might know, it might feel like other people know more, but really they just know differently and they have different strengths, and reminding yourself of that. These next 2 are really about you. So like, what's most important to you and what's your definition of success? So not what the world wants for you or those cultural messages that you're getting about what you're supposed to do or who you're supposed to be, but really what's important to you. There was a really good Harvard Business Review article a couple of years ago called How to Stop Caring What People Think About You. And the crux of that article was know yourself. And when you know yourself, you automatically care less about what other people think. It doesn't go away entirely, but you do care less. And then finally, I think as it relates to imposter syndrome, this is the biggest question, which is knowing what's more important than doubt and fear. What's more important than the imposter syndrome that you're feeling? What's more important than potential criticism or even failure? Getting clear on that can help to pull you through imposter syndrome instead of pushing and shoving against it. And this could be something small, like it's more important for me to have dinner with my family than it is to review this PowerPoint another time because I don't feel like I'm ready for the presentation tomorrow. So it could be something small like that. It could also be the mission of your job, your company, your business, a personal mission that you have. My personal mission in my business is to have more women sharing their authentic voices with the world. That mission to me is bigger than any imposter syndrome that I could feel. And so I let that pull me through when I'm feeling like, ooh, do I know enough? Or can I really put myself out there? I'm feeling really vulnerable. I let that mission pull me through in addition to the other tools that we've talked about. All right, so know yourself, ask yourself these questions. And then finally, if you only take away one thing from our session today, I want it to be this: just do it anyway. We talk a lot about confidence in our culture, and I think it is completely overrated. If you are confident, that's awesome. Use it, go strut your stuff, put yourself out there, but you don't have to be confident in order to take action. We've all been in situations where we have taken action when our palms have been sweating, when it feels like our throat or our heart is like jumping up in our throat, or our throat is closing and you're breathing hard. Like, we've all just done the thing anyway, and you can do the thing anyway. You can choose courage over confidence. Understand what's more important to you and let that pull you through. Knowing that once you take that first step, whether you're confident or not, it builds confidence, which then will make it a little bit easier to take the next step. And it becomes this beautiful upward spiral. But you don't have to start with confidence. You can start with action. And I always remind myself of highly accomplished, famous, wonderful people like Michelle Obama and Maya Angelou, who talk actively or have talked actively about experiencing imposter syndrome. And I think if they can publish books and get on stages in front of thousands of people, it clearly doesn't have to hold you back from having the impact that you want to have in your career and in your life as a whole. So you can just do it anyway. All right. So I'm actually going to skip this action planning because we only have a couple of minutes left. So I want to share a few other things, and then we'll have time for one or two questions. So thank you so much for listening today, for participating. I would love for you to think about those actions and take them along with you, but I would love to connect with you as well. So there's a couple of different ways that you can connect with me. LinkedIn is definitely my best social media platform, and I share really frequently on this topic and others. You can also find me on the web, pretty much everywhere. I'm Heather Welpley, and I think I'm the only Heather Welpley. So if you Google me, you will find me. On my website is also information about my book, and you can get my book right on the website. If you've identified with what we've talked about today, particularly the kind of high achieving and perfectionism pieces, you will definitely identify with the book a lot. So you can get that on my website, or you can get the audiobook or ebook on Amazon as well. I send out emails usually once a week. So at the bottom of any page on my website, you can also sign up for my email list. All right. So thank you so much for being here. I do want to quickly answer the question about what you can do for others. And if you have any other questions, you can stick them into the chat, and I'll answer those briefly as well. So this is going to be a really quick rundown. And I will also tell you there's a really great article. If you are a people leader, there is we'll just say if you're a people leader, but it's an interesting article for everyone. A recent Harvard Business Review article called "Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome." A little bit of a clickbaity title, but it really gets into the structural and cultural components of imposter syndrome and some of the things that you can do. So great article. The biggest thing you can do for others is talk about imposter syndrome. Talk about when you're experiencing it now, talk about when you've experienced it in the past. You can also help people come up with their own evidence. So when we talked about, creating the evidence of your qualifications, your experiences, and your success, you can help someone else do that. If you're particularly if you're coaching them, if you are, leading them, and they say something like, "Oh, I don't know if I'm ready for that thing that you think I'd be good at." Help co-create, come up with that list together of their unique strengths, of their accomplishments. And then you can also do things like speak up against the microaggressions, the cultural factors that are at play that can exacerbate imposter syndrome. So for example, if we go back to that example I shared a while ago about you're in a room and you notice that someone shares an idea and it doesn't get listened to, and then someone else shares an idea and everyone listens to it. If you see that happening in front of you, raise your hand or speak up and say, Katie shared a really similar idea a few minutes ago. I'd love to hear from her on this as well. It's not even confrontational, and it's something that's very simple that you can do. So really note when you notice those microaggressions, you can speak up against them, or just when you notice that the loudest, most confident person in the room is getting the opportunities, they're getting listened to, or they're getting hired. If you're involved in hiring decisions, this is a great place to pay attention to that as well. All right. I'm just going to look at the chat really quickly. Are there any other questions that I can answer for you? All right. I think we're at time anyway. My email address, which you can also find on my website, there's a contact form. If you had a question that we didn't have time to answer, or you weren't comfortable answering in the group or asking in the group, you can always email me as well. Or my email is heather@wellplayconsulting.com. But you can just do the contact form on my website as well, and I will get back to you. All right. Someone's asking if I can go back to the get to know yourself slide. Yes, thank you. We'll go back to that. And I'll leave it here. And Pat, I will turn it back over to you to close things out.
Great. Thank you, Heather. There were questions on if the recording would be available. We will get that sent out to all of you. So as you're taking a look at the slides and those types of things, we will get you the recording as well so that you can take your notes and kind of take a look at the slides and go back to this. Great presentation. I think probably always timely, but it just seems like a great time as so much has gone on in the past year, and as people are trying to get back on track and get back to a new normal way of doing business and outlook of the future. So that removing that imposter syndrome, self-doubt, all those types of things, highly important. So again, Heather, thank you for your time today. Also, thank you to our sponsors, Starkey Hearing Technologies, Hamline University, and the Young Professionals in Minneapolis. With that, we'll let everyone go. Enjoy your afternoon. And if you have some additional questions or need some additional resources, please feel free to email me or reach out to Heather, and we'd be glad to help you make some connections. Thank you. Enjoy your afternoon.